I love it.
Yeah.
Steve, thanks for joining.
Coming on camera here, Mark, so you can demonstrate that I'm as he promoted me.
Handsome, I love it.
Yeah, I'm gonna go off camera for a minute. I got something going on here that
we need more Miami graduates.
We'll bring the grade point down a little bit, Mark.
Well, trust me, my academic career is. I'm surprised I got any degrees. A lot of grade inflation in my case.
Christina Nelson. I know that name too.
I know. From Nevada. I think Nevada. Christina, where? Carson Valley in the house.
Yeah.
Yep.
China Business Review days.
Yes.
Good to see you.
You too.
Hey, Florence, you're here?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Good to see you.
You too.
We'll just give it another minute. I just realized I'm south of DCA and you're north of DCA.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. I'm in Old Town. So we're Potomac River neighbors, and DCA airport neighbors, I guess.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm in the Palisades.
Yeah, perfect. The planes are flying south. So you'll be good for an hour at least. They're flying over my little townhouse.
It's pretty loud.
We'll just give it one more minute. Hey, Damon, how you doing?
Good. How are you, Mark?
I'm glad you got on.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't stay too long, I don't think. I'll try if I can, but yeah, glad I could make it.
Well, the cat can stay.
Well, absolutely. Hey, Rob, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, David. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Got a big sigh from you there. That's all I was picking up.
Well, it's just all this talk about academia. I'm taking my first exams in like 2 decades. It's horrible. It's horrible. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is then me out for the rest of my life. I'm just not doing any more studying.
Oh man, you gotta go for the PhD.
It's not worth knowing. So. Yeah.
All right, so why don't we get going? I'll just do a quick intro, and then for some folks who haven't been on the call, these are pretty straightforward, pretty collegial, pretty fun. Obviously, you have Florence's bio, so I'm not going to waste your time with that. I'm just going to give you 2 interesting tidbits about Florence. I actually discovered her. I assumed because you were with Outside Magazine for so long, so I assumed I've read your stuff. But I was in Vermont this summer for a week, which was like transformational. I'd never spent that much time in Vermont. It was absolutely fantastic. And I discovered your book, The Nature Fix, at the best bookstore in the world, the LL Bean in Burlington, Vermont. And the week I spent in Vermont was just fantastic, because it's just so green and got in a lot of good hikes. And of course, like with the Long Trail being there and the Appalachian Trail and the ski culture, then after reading your book, I read like 3 or 4 other books about hiking, and I've read several books now about the Appalachian Trail. Not that I've done anything to actually go into the wilderness, but anyways, your book really set me on a path to just appreciating being outdoors. So, and it's great. What's interesting about Florence is that she spent a lot of time in the Mountain West, and because of her husband, she's moved to Washington, D.C., which Christina Nelson can attest to, who has left D.C. to go back to the great state of Nevada. But it's just interesting moving from the beautiful Mountain West to the urban swamp that is Washington, D.C. And just the, our inability to kind of connect with nature, even though D.C. is a very green city, very walkable, just how important it is. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn over to Florence. She's going to chat for a bit, and we'll just have some, good questions. Anybody can ask anything, and we'll just have a good little chat. So Florence, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to come on. Your book group sounds really interesting. Your sort of professional group, and I just want to sort of preface by saying that I'm actually I'm recording all week my new book on audio, And so my voice is a little bit strained today, and I'm sort of being a little bit protective of it. So I may not talk for quite as long early on, and then I'd love to open up the discussion.
Yeah, perfect.
I was really interested, Mark, what you were saying about how being in New England was transformative for you. And I'd love to hear from your members about how your relationships to nature may have changed during the pandemic. If you are using sort of time in nature in different ways from perhaps before the pandemic. I know actually, even I, who love nature and time in nature, have had a little bit of a different relationship to it. But I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about why I wrote the book and some of the main overarching sort of lessons I learned. My guess is this group is particularly interested in the sort of creativity and productivity piece of the benefits. So, as Mark mentioned, I've been a journalist for Outside Magazine. I also write for National Geographic and a bunch of other places. And I spent 23 years of my adult life living in the Rocky Mountains. And then my family moved to Washington, D.C. It was actually about 9 years ago now. And I was really spoiled. I had lived right outside of Boulder, or actually in Boulder, Colorado. I had these beautiful trails, open space outside my back door. I had this kind of almost hourly exposure to nature because even from my windows, I could see the Rocky Mountains. Christina, I'm very jealous. You actually moved the right direction. And when I moved to DC, I really noticed the noise pollution. I noticed those low-flying aircraft. I noticed the asphalt, the sort of monochromatic. I noticed the crowds. And I felt like I was more anxious. I had trouble sleeping when I moved here. I felt just anxious and I felt depressed. And I started to really wonder about how much my external landscape got reflected in my internal emotional landscape. I knew this term coined by the journalist Richard Louv, which is nature deficit disorder. And I wondered if that's what I was experiencing and if the science really had anything sort of real, to say about that. And so I got an assignment from outside to write about the science behind why we sometimes feel great when we're outside in nature. And I found some ongoing science actually in Japan. So I went to Japan and I found some physiologists and anthropologists who were studying what happens to the human nervous system when we're in the woods for even just 15 minutes. And they had been sending groups of about 600 people total out into these, what in Japan they actually call forest therapy trails, measuring their blood pressure, their cortisol levels, their heart rate variability, all these measures of stress, and then sending them for a similar amount of time to walk around urban landscapes. So they were still getting the same amount of exercise, and they were getting sort of the same amount of time outside. But in fact, they were really only seeing these benefits to the cardiovascular system and the nervous system after time in nature, which I thought was pretty interesting. They found actually up to a 16% reduction in cortisol levels. And that was honestly after 15 minutes of being outside. Now, the forest therapy trails in Japan are pretty interesting because there are rangers who take people out if you want to do that. And they're very practiced in what they call forest bathing, which is basically sort of opening up your senses and being kind of mindful in the moment, so that these rangers will just kind of cue you in to, hey, what sounds are you hearing on this trail? What are some of the smells that you're sensing off the trees? Let's drink some bark tea and see how that feels. And, looking at colors and fractal patterns and so on. And that turns out kind of the shortcut almost to this kind of stress reduction, which makes sense because if your sensory brain is opening up, then your sort of cognitive thinking brain is maybe taking a little bit of a break. So that's where we get into some really interesting benefits in terms of productivity and cognition. In Japan, they're really interested in stress reduction because there's a very high suicide rate there. People work the longest hours in the world. Very stressed out population. So the government there is really promoting these forest therapy trails. Same is true in Scandinavia, which I also ended up visiting for an additional sort of related article on the power of parks for National Geographic. People in Scandinavia are really interested in kind of the mental health benefits and preventing or treating depression, anxiety, which are chronic mental health issues. But at the time, this was before the pandemic, a lot of the researchers, the neuroscientists and the psychologists in the United States were really interested in looking at productivity. So how can we get office workers to put more hours in at work? How can we get them to be sharper throughout the day? How can we get them to sort of, be more creative? And so I spent a lot of time with a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Utah. His name's David Strayer. I have a couple chapters about him in the book. And he is a big proponent of backpacking and canoeing. He found that he got his best ideas after he'd spent a few days in nature, specifically on backpacking trips or river trips. And he started sort of popularizing this term, the 3-day effect, which is actually the last third of my book. It sort of focuses in on what happens to your brain after 3 days. If we know after 15 minutes, your cardiovascular system changes. Well, he found that after 3 days, what happens is that our frontal cortex really dials down in activation. So we start thinking less about our sort of task-oriented minds, our to-do list mind. And other psychologists are looking through imaging studies at one part of the frontal cortex called the subgenual prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of the brain linked to rumination, or sort of thinking the same largely negative thoughts over and over again, which we do if we're sort of, fixated on a problem in our life. And that part of the brain is actually linked to depression, and rumination is linked to depression. So these two neuroscientists have done really interesting imaging studies. One found that this part of the brain really does dial down after time in nature. In one case, just after 90 minutes in nature. Again, that was for depression. But for creativity, David Strayer was looking at 3 days, found a 50% improvement in creativity after 3 days outside based on creativity tests. That study was actually replicated in Minnesota, also found a 50% improvement. And the theory there is that when we're outside for long enough periods of time, the sort of our modern lives kind of drop away. Other studies have shown that after 3 or 4 days in nature, especially if we're sleeping, under the stars, we actually start dreaming about outdoor spaces instead of indoor spaces. That our sensory brains really come online. We see things after 3 days that we didn't see the first day. Our sensory brains become really sharp, which is really, really interesting because in effect, it is taking some glycogen and resources away from our task-oriented brain, which in effect rests this part of our brain. So it's like a muscle. And if you can rest our cognitive sort of executive network, when you go back to the office 3 or 4 days later, you're really on top of your game. And so, places like Facebook, have kind of figured this out a little bit. I mean, there are now walking trails, all over the roof of Facebook. You see these gorgeous campuses. Amazon is now building these huge greenhouses in Seattle. Lots of these tech campuses are providing not only walking spaces outdoors, but actually break rooms indoors. So like Google campus in Zurich has this room full of giant fig trees and potted plants where, these millennials love to go, and they bring their laptops in there and they take their breaks in there, they eat in there. They have sort of a micro dose, if you will, of nature, and they find it very restorative and comforting. So I think, maybe that's a good place to start. If you have questions, I'd be happy to take them. I have written quite a bit about the sort of nature pyramid, which is this idea that there are different, almost like a food pyramid, there are different doses of nature, and different immersion kind of hierarchies, from wilderness at the top to sort of our bread and butter nearby nature in our cities and offices. And there are different benefits at each of those levels. And many of us, I think, through the pandemic, have really learned to, perhaps, this is my question to you, appreciate your nearby nature and maybe relate to it in new ways. So do you all find that you get some juice and some energy from being outside, and how has that changed at all?
I'll go first. I mean, for sure, Florence. Thanks. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that. And for my part, without question, time in nature is helpful physically, mentally, with relationships. I go backpacking at least once a year with a couple of buddies, and we've found that time. And particularly like the unexpected times, like, most recently we were in the Grand Canyon and it was really, really hot a couple of the days, and we had to totally shift our schedule for the day. And we had one time where from like 11 in the morning till the following morning at 4, we were on this one plateau halfway out of the canyon. We had nothing, no cell phones, nothing to distract us. And it was one of those days I'll never forget, just personally. And then in terms of our relationship, we went deeper and we covered all kinds of things. So, I mean, I think it just hits on so many different levels. And, the challenge is that there are so many distractions that can keep us from it, because there's so many immediate other ways to spend time. But I can tell you for sure, it's become, even as I get older, more important and more intentional, my time with it. So I'm really interested to learn about the book. And I have a question I want to ask downstream, but I don't want to keep talking. There are a lot of others who probably have things.
Great, thanks. I see Ted Cruz has raised a hand. Ted, can you?
Yeah, thanks for being on here. And Mark, thanks for hosting. It's Todd Cruz.
Todd Cruz.
Which is great because people think I say Tom Cruise and they hang up the phone on me. So I've read your book. I've also read Richard Louve's Last Child in the Woods. And I reflected on these because in October, anyone knows the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, BWCA? I live in Minnesota and went there in October, which was great because let me tell you, there was no traffic out there. We saw people paddling, but it was really thin and very relaxing. In fact, I think you paddled there, right?
I have.
Yeah. Okay. So my question, I'm dovetailing the two books, and I'm really curious what you thought of Louve's commentary. Basically, it's this iron triangle of schools that don't want to deal with students, so they work with pharma to get everybody they can on Ritalin. And he argues, no, get them off Ritalin and get them out in nature. And as a recovering cub master, it's really on my mind because just getting parents out in the woods is a challenge. So I think about somebody like Greta, who's going to save the planet. How much, what does she do out in nature? Because demographically, our younger generation, I just see the decline in scouts. I see the decline in a lot of things related to nature, other than, maybe going to this garden where the Japanese millennials hang out. So I'm curious, putting the two books together, if you could speak to that, and I'll be silent.
Thanks for your comments, Todd. So I do have a chapter actually on teenagers in the book who participate in a boarding school for kids with ADHD and also who are on the autism spectrum. And they are really unable to learn in conventional classrooms where there are four walls and, very prescribed sort of sit down kind of curriculum. They really thrive when they're outdoors. Their brains are actually so good at sort of taking in lots of information from the weather, from the rock climbing that they're doing while they're learning geology and so on. And I just wish that, neurotypical and neurodifferent kids could have these options of different kinds of learning environments. So I am completely, I think, on the same page as Richard Louv about a lot of these things. I am, however, very reluctant to give people advice about their medication, not being a medical doctor. Obviously, these drugs do help a lot of people function, in the conventional world and workplaces and school places in which most of us have to deal. But I do know from personal experience, with people in my life that they have found a lot of comfort and reduction in symptoms, through athleticism and through being outside. So I'm a huge supporter of that. And in fact, when I went to Finland to do some research and reporting for the book, kids in Finland have the highest test scores in the world. And there are lots of experts who pontificate about this. And they say, well, it's because the teachers are so well paid and really excellent, or it's because the students are all sort of middle class and very homogeneous and they're well-behaved kids culturally. But if you talk to the teachers, which I did, they say, oh no, the reason our kids are so good at their studies and good at retaining information is that for every 45 minutes of instruction, they get 15 minutes of recess. So they actually have 5 recesses a day. This was in a 6th grade classroom I visited. So they have 5 recesses a day. And the teacher said, we do this because if we didn't, they wouldn't be able to sit still and they wouldn't be able to, retain anything. And so what they do is, the weather is not necessarily very good in Finland, but they have their galoshes, their rain boots, their raincoats all by the front door. They run into them, they run out, they run around for 15 minutes. And this is at the same time my son was in 6th grade with 0 recess in Washington, D.C. And I, of course, got upset about that and talked to the principal, who said, well, it's just so muddy out. We just can't have them tracking mud through the school. So it was like really a janitorial problem. And I am a huge proponent of getting kids outside. And, why are we giving them all these devices, like a lot of schools are now giving, iPads to kids? We should maybe just be giving them some $15 rain boots. I think we'd see a real increase in test scores. So thank you, Todd, for being a scout leader. I am really passionate about the need to get kids outside. It's one of my main messages in my book. And
well, of course, I'm just doing it for the huge pension. But I just want to chime in real quickly on your comment. I think it's a much larger problem across education, because I've now taught at 12 colleges and 2 state prisons.
Wow.
And if no one believes we need education reform, go teach in prison. It will change your mind. That said, my son's science teacher said, because of coronavirus, we're not going to use the microscopes in science because it would require too much cleaning time. So it's the janitorial thing, it's truly amazing. I think the equation should be 45 minutes outside and 15 minutes reading a book, and, quit selling iPads.
Or give every kid their own, what do you call it? Magnifying glass, right? Those cost like 50 cents, and send them outside.
I'm glad you said that. And I'm going to be silent after this. I went to Goodwill and I bought a clock radio for $3. I gave it to my son, who took it apart and then reassembled it, and it still worked. He probably learned more in that exercise than the roughly $12,000 we spend per student general funding in Minnesota. All right, enough of that. You're the guest, not me.
I do see a question here in the chat box. Greg is asking if there's a difference between shore and forest from a psych standpoint. There doesn't seem to be. I don't talk a lot about coastlines and oceans in the book, just because there was another book that came out before mine called Blue Mind, which did talk about that. And a lot of the researchers I visited were in sort of heavily forested places. But people derive a ton of emotional and psychological sort of relief from their shores and coastlines, especially in the UK, where studies have found that people who live near the coasts are the happiest people in the UK. And there was also a study there, sort of getting to the dose question, looked at, I think, hundreds of thousands of people and their health records and where they lived, and found that the people who lived closest to green space and spent up to 2 hours a week kind of outside had the optimum sort of health and well-being. So 2 hours a week outside, if you're in the UK, seemed to be kind of the magic number for optimal health. Finland did a similar set of studies and found 5 hours a month. So maybe the people in Finland needed a little bit less time to stay sane. And of course, this was all before the pandemic. So now it may be even more. Robert Brown has a question.
Hi, Florence. I just got back from a 9-day trek through the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which requires about 90 miles under your own power, or a combination of horses, hiking, pack rafting. My question is, when you're in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, you're very keenly aware, especially when you lay down under the stars at night, that there are animals in the forest that are maybe above you, especially when you're in a mummy bag on the food chain. And I'm wondering if the stress level that you're experiencing from a safety perspective degrades the value or the benefit that you get otherwise.
Yeah, great question, Robert. I'm also a huge fan of the Bob Marshall. I lived in Montana for 10 years.
Nice.
And I've floated, including pack rafting, that South Fork of the Flathead. So yeah, large scale predators do make a difference in terms of your sense of safety and security. I actually spent some time a couple of summers ago on a 15-day solo, not in grizzly country, but still in the wilderness. And I can tell you that I was not relaxed really on that trip. So, especially when you're alone in the wilderness, you have to be kind of hyper alert of your surroundings. You have to really think about all of your systems and not messing up in order to stay safe. You'll get a lot of benefits from it, probably, in terms of your self-concept and things like that, but it's not necessarily going to be a relaxing experience. However, studies seem to indicate that if you're in a group, right, humans are meant to live in groups. We are a very social animal. That's how we have managed to stay safe, If you're in a group, you actually can kind of overcome, some of that fear and feel more secure. So I think, the early humans really figured this out by having such social brains. So that would be my recommendation. If a sense of security is part of, your project or your need for emotional safety, maybe don't do it alone.
We did it with a group, and it seems like there's kind of the right number of people you want to bump into on the trail too. Like if you feel like you're out there all alone, it's a little more daunting than if you see a couple other people here and there. That's good. If you see too many, of course, they're ruining the entire experience for you. So it was an interesting experience. So
that's right. And in fact, that even holds when you're not in the wilderness, right? So a lot of women especially talk about not really feeling so safe going to city parks, and walking alone. and that's been a big barrier actually to entry for a lot of urban populations enjoying sort of more urban trails and parks. And so I've been really excited to see the rise of walking groups and hiking groups. I know these have been popular in the UK for a long time, but we're starting to see those, especially in sort of less privileged neighborhoods in DC and in other places where we're seeing sort of walking groups of women. And I really support that trend.
Very good. Thank you. Hey, Mark, I took the liberty of muting you a while ago because we kept hearing your microphone scratch and all that. Sorry about that.
Let's see, Rob Bennett has raised a hand.
Yeah, so thanks. This is fascinating. I've not read your book and maybe you've got the answer in there. But so I can see the correlation between time, but effort, I'm quite interested in. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got these millennials sitting with their laptops amongst fig trees. And I'm sort of slightly dubious as like the eco impact of that, but that's a different thing. But yeah, so sitting sort of, and there's no effort. They just go in with their laptops. And at the other end, I remember a friend who was a colonel in the Marines spent 3 weeks in northern Norway midwinter. So he didn't see the sun for 3 weeks. And then there's a massive party when the sun clips the horizon for the first time. And like the entire town just gets hammered for 48 hours. And there were rich people chartering planes to come in and just to party to see that. And his point was that actually he'd been there for 3 weeks and with his team, and he'd invested in not seeing the sun. So when he saw the sun, it meant something. Whereas these charter planes just come in, go, yeah, they've just left somewhere with the sun. They knew what it looked like. They can remember. And they've flown and went, oh yeah, it's just, now let's get drunk. And so I just wonder, like, kind of what is, I can see the time, but it's the investment. Is there an investment piece there as well?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think those people are really cheating. No fair. Yeah, I mean, when you start, looking at the psychology studies and reading about what is it that makes people feel really resilient, emotionally, it's when we can tell ourselves kind of a story about our lives and where we kind of fit in our world, where we can create and make meaning. And it seems like the people like your friend who really were there for 3 weeks, he had a great story that he was telling himself, which is that I earned this. And so my guess is that was very, very valuable to him, in part because of the effort that he put into. He wasn't just looking for sort of a quick pleasure fix, right? He was actually looking for something a little more meaningful and an experience that was more meaningful. So my guess is he probably did get more out of it, unless he got so depressed before that happened.
I think he was just cold before that.
Yes. Blair, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Florence, and thank you, Mark, for hosting. I have a question that's been, I'm wondering if you've encountered any research on this. So decades ago, maybe 30 years ago, I heard, and I don't remember where, that the reason you get ideas in the shower is because falling water creates negative ions in the air. And so I've been so keenly aware of how, like, the joke in my house is I take a long shower Saturday morning and I come running out of the shower to the laptop because I'm filled with ideas. And years ago, I was biking with a friend of mine, mountain biking, and we stopped at this spot by the river where there's this gentle waterfall. And at the time he was running a B&B, and he said, "This is the thinking place." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, we had a NASA scientist who was staying with us, and he went for a hike and he stopped here and he sat down and he solved some sort of complex trajectory problem. And he wrote about it in the guest book. And I just see it everywhere. Exposure to falling water stimulates creativity. But when you go searching for it, there's not a lot online. Like they talk a little bit about falling water creates negative ions. But then what is it that the ions do? I heard years ago that it stimulates a certain part of the brain, but I can't recall what part of the brain. There's stuff that says it increases oxygen blood flow to all parts of the brain. There's stuff around the dopamine effect. I don't think that's it. Have you encountered anything? Do you know what's going on there?
People do occasionally ask me about the ion thing, and I have not found any good science on it either. But I can tell you that with the hot shower effect, I mean, there are other theories there, having to do with the fact that it is a deeply sensory experience where you're sort of, you're able to kind of gently space out a little bit. And that act of not sort of aggressively pursuing an answer kind of creates some space where unexpected connections can get made in your brain. Nikola Tesla came up with his idea for diesel engine while he was walking in a park. And James Watt came up with the invention of the steam engine while he was walking in a park. Beethoven used to routinely go for walks and literally hug trees. So there are a lot of anecdotes about nature in general, just sort of providing this, less sort of cognitively demanding environment where our brains can kind of goof off a little bit and make some creative connections. So I wouldn't be surprised if it really has nothing to do with the ions, but has to do with the sort of sensory environment. And certainly when you're sitting by a river, there are a lot of interesting things that can happen. So you're hearing the sounds of water, which we know psychologists have sort of proved that to be very relaxing. We know that there are some fractal patterns in the play of the current and the sun and so on. And in my book, I have this really cool interview with a physicist who talks about what those fractal patterns do to our brain waves. It's sort of like those, those screensavers that get all wiggy and you go kind of woo. So we often see fractal patterns in nature. We see them, in trees, we see them on coastlines and in waves. So I think there could be a lot going on there that is actually way beyond just the ions.
So I recognize there is a lot going on there. There are no fractal patterns in a shower. Cold shower works just as well as a hot shower. And I know, one of the keys to creativity is you think about the problem and then you go do something repetitive. And mindless. So walking, but even like painting a wall, help your subconscious works away at it. So I understand the power of all that, but I am so struck by the impact of falling water. It's just so clear to me that something is, I live in nature. I don't so it's not a rare thing. I'm just so struck by it. Okay. And so I'll keep searching for an answer.
I see Greg Bunch put a link here in the chat. So that might be worth checking out. My guess is that with a lot of these things in nature, elements of nature, they don't work for everybody. One experiment I did was I took a group of hikers up into the woods and we tested their blood pressure before and after. We'd been walking for a while. They had some time to sort of sit, and recover just their cardio capacity. But almost everybody's blood pressure dropped when they were sitting next to a creek. But there was one person whose blood pressure went way up, and this was the person who was made very anxious by the sound of running water. So I think, if you get your ideas in the shower, then by all means go for it.
Keep taking showers. Okay. Thanks.
You'll be really clean, if nothing else.
I have a question, Florence.
Yes, Christina.
So, as Mark mentioned, I moved back to this area. I'm in the Carson Valley in Nevada. It's in the Eastern Sierra. I grew up here and moved back after about 20 years away. Being outside, being in nature has been, an amazing benefit of being back here. I really missed it a lot. But a new experience for me after being away for so long is the very severe wildland fires that we're dealing with. And I'm curious to know if you know of any research on the mental health impacts of dealing with this, because I found it to actually be quite traumatic in a way I didn't quite expect.
Yes, Christina, I am sorry that you had such a terrible summer there. I think you're right. In general, humans tend to feel relaxed when they feel safe. And we like environments that are green and that have fresh water, and that are really conducive to sort of healthy living and finding sustenance. So, that's why, probably so many people love golf courses. It sort of reminds us of this savanna, sort of shared savanna, grassland, woodland combination that makes so many people so happy. And unfortunately, when you have wildfire smoke, it does exactly the opposite. It makes you feel very threatened. In fact, the human sense of smell is pretty strong. And one of the reasons is that it needs to be vigilant for exactly that, for fire. So it makes sense that it would set your nervous system on edge. And I do worry so much about climate change and what it's going to mean for mental health, as well as for everything else.
Florence, I'll ask you, kind of pivoting on that, what Christina said, just about access. Obviously some of the adventures that have just been shared on this call require a lot of planning, a lot of gear. I was even talking to somebody the other day about, like, even if you go into the woods for 3 or 4 nights, like, how do you pack for food? And, if you don't have that exposure or that understanding, or just getting a sense, like growing up around that, being outdoors can be really intimidating. Like, where do you start? I'm just curious if you know some good programs or people that are doing some good work, getting kids that normally wouldn't have a chance, but that are getting folks out into the woods or kids out into the woods.
Yeah, great question, Mark. I tell people who are intimidated by nature to start really small. And it may just be starting with, eating lunch outside, sitting on a park bench, just feeling comfortable listening to some birds, because there are a lot of kids who have never done that. I went on a Girl Scout trip in DC, just to our local trail, and there were 10 and 11-year-old girls on that trip who looked like they were about to fall over when they were walking on the trail, and it's because they had never walked on an uneven surface before. So start small, build up slowly. I'm a huge fan of scouting, as I mentioned. Scouting reaches more kids than any other organization in the country. Fortunately, there are lots more sort of groups starting up to get kids outside as this kind of research, becomes better known. I know some pediatricians are now actually prescribing time in parks to their patients and their patient families, because they have seen benefits to things like childhood depression and obesity when they tell their kids to go play outside. Unfortunately, through the pandemic, one of the things that has happened is that adults are actually exercising a little bit more, but children are exercising dramatically less, and they're eating more. So I think it's going to take a while to kind of address and undo some of those effects. Hopefully we'll be able to. And I'm also hoping that it has encouraged communities to put more resources into their parks. We need bigger parks. We need better quality parks. We need better and more equal access to parks across cities. And then for things like, if you do get ambitious and want to go out for a weekend, REI, actually has some great classes in packing and packing light and what kind of gear to bring. So that's pretty cool.
Well, that's great. We're 45 minutes after the hour, and I don't want to hold you up anymore, Florence. I appreciate you coming on. Is it cool if I share your email with the group if people want to follow up? All right, cool.
Absolutely. Thanks. And I do have a new book coming out, and there's a trailer for that up on my website. So.
Oh, great. I'll share that with the group, and super excited. And this was great. Thanks for getting on. Maybe I'll run into you in the Palisades.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks. Really enjoyed your group. Thanks, everybody.
Ciao. See you.
Thank you.
Okay, ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark.
Hey, Blair, great game last night in Edmonton.
Thanks, Mark.
I didn't watch it, but I saw the highlights. I saw you were watching it on Twitter. I couldn't find a way to watch it.
It was
wasn't on
Paramount Plus, but it was like the most Canadian experience ever. It was fantastic. It was great.
-9 Celsius.
Yeah, fantastic.
Frozen artificial turf.
Isoteca. They were calling it the Azteca, Isoteca or something. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's that's an unfair advantage over a country like Mexico.
You got to do what you got to do, man. But the U.S. and Canada are supposed to play January 30th in Canada.
Yeah, an undetermined location.
Yeah. So I was joking, it's going to be in one of the territories, one of the capital territory cities.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Florence was great. I haven't read
Yeah,
the
it
book,
was
but I
great.
ordered it, so
Yeah, no, it was fantastic.
yeah.
How's everything else going?
Good. We lost flooding and